The morning of Sarah Vance's wedding, Calder Hollis woke before dawn and lay still in the dark,
It's
listening
stuck!
to the river.
Push!
He had
trying,
not
it's
planned
heavy.
to be awake.
One
He
more
had not
time!
planned to think about it. He had spent 2 years practicing the art of not thinking about things, and he was getting better at it, the way you get better at anything you do every single day without exception. But the river was loud that morning, swollen with October rain, and the sound of it came through the east wall the way cold always came through the east wall, regardless of what he packed into the cracks. He gave up on sleep around 5 and built the fire back up and put the kettle on. His cabin sat a quarter-mile from the nearest cluster of houses in Ashwood, which was not much of a town to begin with. Ashwood existed the way a lot of small Oregon frontier settlements existed in those years, because someone had stopped there, and then someone else had, and eventually stopping had become staying, and staying had become the kind of permanence that outlasts the reasons for it. There was a general store, a mill, a church with a leaning steeple, a tavern that served better food than the name suggested, and a woman named Agnes Holt, who had been the closest thing to a doctor within 40 miles for the past 30 years. Calder worked for Agnes 3 days a week. The other 4 days he worked for the forest. The cabin had been his father's. His father had been a carpenter, a quiet man with large hands who had taught him 2 things before a tree came down wrong during a cutting and ended the teaching: how to read a piece of wood for where it wanted to split, and how to sit with someone who was hurting without trying to fix the hurt with words. Both lessons had turned out to be more useful than any formal education Calder had received, which was not extensive. He had grown up after that in Agnes's house, not as a son exactly, more as a purpose she had decided to take on without being asked. He had grown up watching her work. He had grown up understanding that the most valuable thing a person could be, most of the time, was simply present and skilled. Not powerful, not important, just there with steady hands and enough knowledge to be useful. He had been almost enough once. That was the other thing he carried. Last January, a boy named Thomas, 8 years old, son of the mill operator, who had gone out on the river ice when the ice was not ready. Calder had been the closest person. He had gone in after him. He had been fast. He had not been fast enough. Thomas had survived. He had lost 2 fingers on his left hand to the cold, and Calder had carried that specific winter inside his chest and ever since. Not the cold of the water, but the feeling of reaching and coming up half an inch short. The feeling of almost. It was why his feet moved before his mind when they needed to. He had noticed this about himself. He did not examine it too closely. Examining things too closely had not, in his experience, made them smaller. He dressed, drank his tea, standing at the window, and watched the light come up gray and slow over the tree line. Somewhere in the village, in a white dress that her mother had sewn and resewn until it was right, Sarah Vance was getting ready to marry a man named David Ellers, who owned a dry goods operation in the next town over and had a roof that did not require seasonal patching. Calder did not blame her. He had never blamed her. She had kind eyes and a laugh that could fill a room, and she deserved every solid and reliable thing the world had to offer. He had just, for a while, allowed himself to think that what he had to offer might also be enough. He had been wrong about that, and he had been careful and quiet about the wrongness ever since. He picked up his collecting basket, checked that his kit was in order: clean linen strips, the small sealed tin of drawing salve, his herb knife, the folded square of oilcloth for keeping things dry. And he went out into the rain. The forest east of Ashwood was old growth, not the managed timber stands that covered the ridge to the west, where the logging operations moved in their slow seasonal patterns, but actual old growth, the kind that had been old before anyone in the territory could remember, where the Douglas firs grew to heights that made you feel, standing beneath them, like a minor feature of the landscape. Most people in Ashwood kept a practical distance from the old growth. The trees grew close. The light got strange. Sound moved differently between the trunks than it did in open air, arriving from directions that didn't match their sources. Calder had been going in since he was 12 years old. He knew where the game trails were and what they indicated about water. He knew which mosses grew on which faces of which stones and what that told you about prevailing wind. He knew where the river mint grew thickest along the eastern bank and which pools held the cold water plants Agnes used for reducing inflammation, and where the particular shelf fungus grew that, dried and ground fine, could slow a deep bleeding wound long enough to matter. The forest had taught him most of what he knew. Agnes had taught him the rest. Between the two of them, he had become useful in ways that didn't require a title or a certificate. He was following a trail of river mint east along the bank, further than he usually went, when the rain picked up again. He pulled his hood and considered the basket in his hand and decided the mint was worth another 20 minutes of soaking. He heard it before he saw it. Not wind, not water, not any animal he recognized. A low, compressed sound. The sound of someone working very hard not to make noise and failing at the edges of the effort. He found the wagon half in the river. The front axle had shattered on the ford stones. The whole frame had tilted sideways and then downstream. Its load scattered across the shallows. Wooden crates, a traveling chest with its latches sprung open, bundled oilcloth spread dark and heavy across the rocks. The horses were gone. Whether they had been cut loose or had pulled free on their own, there was no way to tell. There was no one else visible on either bank. And there, pinned beneath the passenger side of the tilted frame, her legs caught under the weight of it, and the lower half of her body submerged in water that couldn't have been above 40 degrees, was a woman unlike anyone Calder had seen before. He registered the details the way you register things when your mind is already moving toward a decision it has already made. She was green-skinned, broad-shouldered, with dark hair plastered flat by the rain, and a jaw set tight against pain she was clearly working to contain. Her features were angular and striking. Not the soft roundness he was used to, but something harder and more deliberate, the kind of face that had been shaped by consequence rather than circumstance. She was close to his height, maybe an inch taller, with the build of someone who had been working hard all her life. The clothing beneath the river mud was not the clothing of a traveler of modest means. That was the first thing he noticed. She looked at him when he approached. Her eyes were dark amber, almost copper, and they assessed him in a single sweep. The way you might assess a road for how passable it was, what it might cost you, whether the destination was worth it. Then she asked her question, "Why do you care if I live or die?" It was not hostile. It was genuinely curious, in the flat, level way of someone asking about weather, as if the answer might actually determine whether she allowed him to continue. Calder stood in the freezing shallows and considered it for a moment. Then he told her he was a healer of sorts, that she was clearly injured, and that he had never once in his life been able to walk away from someone who needed help. He said it without grandeur. It was just true. She studied him for another moment. Then she looked away, toward the far bank. He took that as permission and got to work. The wagon frame was too heavy to lift clean, but the angle was working in his favor. If he could get something under the near corner and change the tilt by even a few inches, the pressure on her legs would shift enough. He found the broken axle handle, half submerged in the rocks, jammed it under the near edge of the frame, and threw his weight against it. The wood screamed. The metal groaned. The frame shifted. 2 inches, maybe 3. She pulled herself free with a single sharp sound she cut off almost immediately, dragging her legs clear of the water before the frame settled back down into the stones. He was beside her before she had finished moving. Her legs were bruised badly and the right one worse than the left, but nothing broken. The shoulder was a different matter. It had been wrenched badly, and when he reached to check it, she pulled back before she caught herself. He told her he needed to see it. She allowed it, watching his hands with those copper eyes the entire time. He wrapped the shoulder with clean linen from his kit, working carefully, not rushing. She breathed through her nose in slow counts while he worked, the controlled breathing of someone trained not to show pain. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and asked if she could walk. She told him she could do whatever was necessary. He believed her. He also watched her try to stand, saw the weight come down wrong on the right leg, saw her catch herself against the wagon frame with an intake of breath she covered almost instantly. He told her his cabin was a quarter mile. He told her she could lean on him if she needed to. She looked at him for a long moment, this rain-soaked man with his herb basket and his patched coat and his honest face. Something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, more like a recalculation. She told him she would manage, but she walked close to him the entire way. And twice on the uneven path, he felt her hand brush against his shoulder, steadying herself without asking and without acknowledging that she had done it. He didn't mention it. She didn't mention it. The rain came down on both of them equally, and the forest watched them pass the way old forests watch everything, without judgment and without hurry. It was on the path, in that gray October rain, that Calder noticed the ring. He had been adjusting the linen wrapping at her wrist when he felt it, the shape of it beneath the bandage, the weight of the metal. When the cloth shifted, he caught a glimpse. Dark metal, heavy gauge, engraved with a pattern that was too precise and too deliberate to be decorative. He had seen that same pattern somewhere in the past 30 seconds, without registering it consciously, on the edges of the armor visible beneath her mud-soaked travel clothes. Not a soldier's standard issue. Something older. Something specific. He wrapped the bandage back and said nothing. He had learned from Agnes that people who were in pain or afraid always had things they weren't ready to explain. You didn't push. You tended the wound in front of you and let everything else come in its own time. It always came. He let it go, and they walked the rest of the way in silence. Her name, she told him that first evening, was Mara. She said it the way someone says a name they have used so long it has lost its individual weight, automatically, without ceremony. She offered no last name, no clan, no explanation for what she had been doing on a Ford road alone with a supply wagon and no visible escort. He didn't ask. He gave her his sleeping mat and made up his place by the hearth. She protested this exactly once. He told her she was injured and he was not, and that was the end of the discussion. She watched him arrange himself on the floor with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between disbelief and a reluctant respect that she clearly hadn't intended to show. He made broth from what he had, which wasn't much. A heel of cured meat, dried mushrooms, a handful of river herbs. It was thin and plain, and she ate every drop of it without comment. When he offered the last of his bread, she took it, and then she said quietly that she hadn't eaten in 2 days. He went back to the pantry and found what he had overlooked: a small wheel of hard cheese he had been saving, a handful of dried plums. He put them in front of her without ceremony. She ate slowly after that, watching the fire. He tended the fire and didn't stare at her. He had learned over years of sitting with sick people that those who were in pain or frightened did not want to be looked at directly. They wanted to be near someone calm. So he was calm. He sorted his herbs. He checked her bandages once, quietly. He boiled water and made a tea of willow bark and dried elderflower that would ease the swelling in her shoulder. And he set it beside her without explaining what it was. She picked up the cup and smelled it before drinking. He noted that. A person who knew what they were doing, checking for something. He filed it away with the ring and the armor and the riding posture he had noticed on the path. The way she held her weight, even injured, that was not the posture of a merchant or a traveler. She slept eventually, tipped sideways on the mat with her back to the wall and her good arm tucked in close to her body. He heard her, sometime deep in the night, make a sound in her sleep. A word in a language he didn't know, sharp and pained. It sounded like a name or an order. He lay still by the dying fire and listened to the rain and thought about the ring. On the second day, the cultural misunderstandings began. She watched him hold the door for an elderly neighbor who passed by on the road and then stood in genuine confusion until he explained that it was considered polite. She said with complete sincerity that in her experience, holding a door for a capable adult was a way of suggesting they could not manage it themselves. He spent several minutes attempting to explain that human politeness was less logical than it appeared. She remained unconvinced but filed it away. Later that same afternoon, she picked up one of the heavier logs he was preparing to carry and walked it inside without comment, leaving him standing in the yard with the smaller piece. He followed her in and told her she was supposed to be resting. She said she was resting her arm, not her legs. He said that was technically accurate, but missed the spirit of the thing. She said she was not particularly interested in the spirit of the thing when there was wood to be moved. He gave up. She smiled just at the corner of her mouth and picked up another log. It was the first time he saw her smile. He thought about it later, alone by the dying fire, in a way he decided not to examine too closely. On the third day, Agnes came. She appeared at the door in her oilskin coat with a bundle under her arm, tinctures, fresh bandaging, a small jar of the anti-inflammatory compound she made in batches every autumn. She stepped inside, took one long look at Mara, set the bundle on the table, and left without a word. No questions, no commentary, just the bundle and the closed door behind her. Calder called after her, but she was already down the path. He turned back and found Mara watching him with an expression he was starting to recognize. That recalibrating look, like she was updating something she had written down. He said Agnes was like that. She noticed things and acted on them and considered explanation optional. Mara said that sounded like someone worth knowing. He said she was the best person he had ever met. He said it simply, without inflation, and Mara was quiet for a moment after that. On the fourth day, she tried to help him work. He came back from the woodpile to find her standing at his work table, attempting to grind dried bark with her good arm, the other still bound against her chest. She had made a reasonable job of it, all things considered. He stood in the doorway and watched for a moment, and then told her gently that she didn't have to do that. She told him, without looking up, that she was not accustomed to being useless. He said she wasn't useless. She was injured, which was different. She said she didn't see a meaningful distinction. He thought about arguing the point and decided against it. He set the wood down and came to stand beside her, and together they finished the grinding, him doing the heavy pressing, her managing the fine work with her good hand, both of them adjusting to each other's presence in the small space without discussing it. He noticed that she worked with no wasted motion, every action efficient and deliberate. She noticed that he never reached across her without pausing first, always giving her space to move if she wanted to. Small things. But small things were what built the days. He taught her to make the willow bark tea herself, walking her through the proportions in the steep time. She absorbed it with a focused precision that told him she had been educated seriously and across a wide range. She already knew several of the plants by their medicinal properties, though she used names he had never heard for them. On the fourth evening, with the fire low and the rain steady against the window, she told him about the ambush. She told it the way a person reports a tactical situation. Facts first, emotion nowhere visible. She had been traveling with an escort, small for discretion. 2 days prior, on a road she knew well, they had been hit. The attack had been organized. Not opportunistic, not bandits looking for cargo. Unorganized, targeted, timed with a precision that required advanced knowledge of her route. She had been moving since the night of the ambush without stopping to sleep. She had gotten out. The others had not. She had been moving west through the forest ever since, trying to reach a town called Iron Pass. Calder listened without interrupting. What she said next, she said carefully, watching the fire rather than him. The only survivor of her escort, a man she had managed to get clear before the end, was holding a sealed letter for her. The letter contained information that would create serious consequences for people she was responsible for if it reached the wrong hands. If she did not reach Iron Pass and retrieve it within 10 days of the ambush, the man had instructions to deliver it to her clan's council, to be opened and acted upon in her absence. She paused. She said the ambush had been 2 days ago. She said she had not stopped moving since the night it happened. She said she had been awake for close to 40 hours when she went into the river. Calder did the arithmetic without speaking. 10 days. 2 gone. 4 days on the road to Iron Pass, based on what he knew of the frontier territory. She needed her shoulder functional enough to ride. She needed at least 2 more days of rest before that was realistic. That left a margin of perhaps 2 days on either end if nothing else went wrong. She was not here only to recover. She was here because this was the only place no one knew she was. He looked at her across the fire, this woman with her copper eyes and her controlled breathing and her heavy ring, and he thought about what it took to sit that still when the clock inside you was running. He told her he would help her figure out the route. She looked at him. Not the assessment from the river, something slower. She said she didn't need the road. She knew the route. She just needed the shoulder to cooperate. He nodded. Then he went and rebuilt the fire, because that was something he could do. And sometimes the most useful response to a situation that you could not fix was to do the thing in front of you well. The days continued building. She learned that he hummed when he was thinking. Low, tuneless, barely there. He learned that she tracked the road through the window whenever a sound came from outside. A quick flick of her copper eyes, gone before you would notice if you were not paying attention. He was paying attention. On the 5th evening, he asked her where she had learned herbalism. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said a woman who had been important to her had taught her when she was young. A woman who believed that a leader should never be entirely dependent on others for knowledge that could save lives. Calder said that sounded like wisdom. Mara said the woman had been full of it, and that she hadn't appreciated it properly until it was too late to say so. He understood that completely. They sat with him for a moment. The silence of two people who have both lost someone who taught them who to be, sitting across a fire and recognizing the shape of it in each other. He told her about his father then, the carpenter, the tree that came down wrong, the winter of the boy in the river. Not everything, but enough. He told it quietly, without self-pity, just as a fact about who he was. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said that losing the people who taught you how to be yourself took something from you that nothing else quite replaced. He said, yes, that was exactly it. She looked at him then, really looked. Not the road assessment from the first morning, but something slower and more open. And he felt suddenly visible in a way he had not felt in a very long time. He looked at the fire. She looked at the fire. The room was warm. On the sixth day, she began moving again in earnest. He came back from the woodpile to find her outside, working through what was clearly a training sequence. Slow, controlled, one-armed, testing the healing shoulder with methodical patience. She didn't stop when she heard him. She finished the sequence, then lowered her arm carefully and stood looking at the tree line. He set the wood down and told her it looked like military training. She said most things she did looked like military training. He asked carefully what kind of work she had been doing before the road. She said she managed logistics and security for a large family operation in the Eastern Territories. She said it in a tone that did not invite follow-up. He nodded and carried the wood inside, and she followed him in after a moment and sat on the bench by the window without waiting to be invited. The first time she had made herself at home without some form of permission. He found himself smiling at his work and made sure she couldn't see it. On the sixth evening, she told him something without decoration or preamble, as was becoming familiar. She told him that his broth had too much salt. He stood at the pot for a moment processing this, and then started laughing. She looked at him with genuine uncertainty, clearly working out what the correct response to laughter was in this context. He explained that among his people, you generally either lied politely or stayed quiet about food you had been given for free. She said that seemed inefficient. He agreed that it probably was. On the seventh night, there was something large near the fence. He went out with a torch and a skinning knife, which he understood was not an impressive arsenal. Before he reached the fence, she was beside him, moving in complete silence despite the healing shoulder, the long knife from her boot in her good hand, with an ease that made his skinning knife feel decorative. They stood together in the dark until whatever it was decided against further investigation and moved back into the trees. He let out a slow breath. She was still beside him, alert, entirely unbothered. He told her she hadn't needed to come out. She said she had heard him get up. He said he had tried to be quiet. She said he was quiet enough for someone who wasn't really trying to be quiet. He pointed out she was still injured. She pointed out he had gone outside alone with a very small knife. He had nothing for that. She went back inside before he did. He stood in the cold for a moment, the torch burning down in his hand, telling himself the warmth in his chest was from the fire. It was not from the fire. He recognized sometime before midnight, sitting alone by the hearth after she had gone to sleep, that he was in trouble. He recognized it with a calm clarity, the same way he recognized when a patient was not going to improve on the current course of treatment. He was in trouble, and there was probably nothing to be done about it except behave well for however many days remained before she was healed enough to leave. He planned to behave very well. On the eighth morning, she was sitting on the bench outside when he came out with her tea. He sat beside her without asking, the way you sit beside someone who is clearly thinking something through. The forest was quiet. The rain had stopped for the first time in 3 days. The light came down through the firs in long silver columns and lay across the wet ground carefully, unhurried. After a while, she said she was almost healed enough to travel. He said he knew. A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, just waited. She said there was something she wanted to tell him. She started to speak, then stopped. She looked at the ring on her finger, just for a moment, just a glance, and then she looked at the tree line instead. She said she was grateful for his help. She said she was not accustomed to being helped without an expectation attached. He told her there was no expectation. She said she knew that. She said that was the part she found difficult to understand. He thought about it. Then he said he supposed he had grown up watching someone take care of people who could offer nothing back, and that it had come to seem like the natural way of things. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said his name, Calder, the first time she had used it. And when he looked at her, she was looking at him with something in her expression he did not have a word for, but that settled somewhere behind his sternum and stayed there. She did not finish what she had been going to say. He did not push. He thought later that if she had told him that morning, everything might have gone differently. But she hadn't. The morning had passed, and then it was afternoon. And then the riders came. 4 of them, moving fast on the road that ran past his fence. The first one pulled up at the sight of smoke from his chimney. Calder was outside splitting wood, and he watched them approach with the stillness of someone who had learned, over years of life at a road's edge, to read horses and riders at a distance. The lead rider was a large orc, older with a face that had been hard for a long time. He looked at Calder with very little interest. He asked in careful common English whether a woman of their clan had passed through. Calder started to answer. Mara came around the side of the cabin. The change in the riders was immediate. The lead rider dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, going to one knee with a speed that looked involuntary, like a reflex older than thought. The 3 behind him followed. They spoke to her in their own language, urgent, formal, layered with something that sounded like relief. And she answered in kind, and everything about the air around her changed. She stood straighter. The careful quietness she had kept for 8 days became something else. Not stiff, not performed, but settled. She was not hiding anymore. She was simply herself fully, and herself was something that made 4 armed soldiers kneel in the mud of a country road. Calder stood with the axe in his hand and felt the ground shift under him. The lead rider, her chief of guard, a man she would later tell him was named Davin, said something in the clan tongue that made her turn and look at Calder. She said something back, brief and level. Davin looked at Calder again, and this time the look had changed entirely. Assessment, wariness. Something that might, under different circumstances, have been the beginning of respect. Mara walked back across the yard. She stood in front of him, close, and for a moment she said nothing, just looked at his face with the same care she had given the tree line that morning. Then she told him her full name, Mara Stonefall, daughter of Aldrich Stonefall, war chief of the Stone clan, heir to the mountain passes of the Eastern Cascades, the person the ambush had been specifically arranged to remove. She told him he had pulled her out of a river and fed her broth and given her his bed and treated her like a person, and that she had known who she was the entire time. He looked at her, he looked at the riders, he looked back at her. He asked very quietly why she hadn't told him. She said she had wanted, just for a short while, to find out what it was like. What was like, he asked. Being helped without it being about anything else. He set the axe down against the fence post. He looked at his hands. He thought about the ring and the armor, and the careful way she had checked the tea before drinking, and the way she moved, and all the 100 small signals he had filed away without letting himself think about. And he felt something that was not quite hurt and not quite anger, but lived in the same territory as both. He told her he understood. He said it without looking at her. She said his name. He heard something in it, the careful way she shaped it, the way you say something you are afraid of losing. He looked up. He told her she should go with her people, that they had clearly come a long way, that she was clearly needed. She started to speak, and then Davin called out from the road, sharp and urgent, and everything changed again. 3 more riders had appeared at the far end of the road. These ones wore different markings. These ones were not slowing down. What happened next happened fast, and Calder would spend a long time afterward trying to sort the sequence of it into something that made sense in the order it had actually occurred. The 3 riders came in low and hard with the late afternoon sun at their backs, which was not accidental. The angle put the light directly into the eyes of anyone facing them from the road, and the approach used the curve of the tree line to mask their speed until they were close enough that speed was the only thing that mattered. These were not men who had stumbled onto a country road. These were men who had studied the road first. Davin was shouting before they cleared the curve. His 3 riders were already moving, pulling their horses across the road to form a line. Calder did not make a conscious decision. He was moving before the decision formed, dropping the axle he had been using as a splitting wedge, crossing the yard in 4 steps, putting himself between Mara and the approaching riders and pulling her sideways behind the woodpile in a single motion that came from somewhere below thought. He got his shoulder in front of her and stayed there, which was, he would think later, A genuinely ridiculous instinct for a man with no weapon facing mounted attackers on an open road. Mara did not argue with him about this. Not in the moment. She let him pull her. She let him put himself in front. And then Davin's line hit the three riders, and the fight was on the road, and not in the yard. And she was on her feet before the first clash of metal had finished echoing off the tree line, moving out from behind the woodpile with the knife from her boot already in her good hand. Calder ran to keep up with her. She used the corner of the cabin for leverage, came around it low and fast, and caught the third attacker, while Davin's riders handled the first two. The man had pulled wide of the main engagement, trying to circle. He didn't expect anyone to come from the building. She disarmed him with a controlled violence that Calder watched from 6 feet away. Two moves, the second one using the cabin wall itself as part of the geometry, and then the man was on the ground, and Mara was standing over him, breathing hard. It was over in less time than it had taken him to split the last cord of wood. In the aftermath, with his heartbeat loud in his ears and his breath coming in short pulls, Calder stood in the churned mud of his yard and looked at her. She was pressing her good hand against her shoulder, against the bandaging he had put there 8 days ago. Her copper eyes found him across the yard and moved over him quickly, checking for damage, the same efficient sweep she had used at the river to assess whether he was worth the risk of allowing. She crossed the yard to him. She stood close, closer than she usually stood, and looked at his face with focused attention, her hand coming up to press briefly against his shoulder, checking that he was solid, that he was real, that the accounting was correct. He told her he was fine. She said she knew. She said she had watched him put himself between her and mounted attackers with nothing but forward momentum and the apparent intention of inconveniencing them, and that it had been both the most tactically unsound thing she had witnessed in recent memory and the bravest thing anyone had done for her in years. He said it hadn't been brave. It had been reflexive. She said in StoneClan tradition those two things were considered the same. The distance between them was very small. Her hand was still on his shoulder. He said her name, Mara, for the first time since she had told him what it actually meant. She didn't answer in words. She took a slow breath, and her hand moved from his shoulder to the side of his face, just her palm against his jaw. A gentle, careful touch, brief and deliberate, and he went very still. He turned his face slightly into her hand without thinking. Both of them stood without moving. Then Davin called to her from the road, sharp, formal, the voice of someone with a schedule and a duty and a war chief's daughter to deliver intact. And the moment broke. She stepped back, and the air of StoneClan settled back into her posture like water finding its level. But before she turned away, she looked at him one more time. What was in her eyes was not hidden at all. That night, alone in the cabin that still smelled of someone else's presence, of willow bark tea and wood smoke, and the specific quality of air that a second person leaves behind them, Calder sat by the low fire and allowed himself to think about it. He rebuilt the fire because the night was cold and because it was something he could do. She did not leave the next morning. Davin was clearly of the opinion that she should. He said so, or at least the shape of what he said was clear enough, even in the clan tongue, the cadence of a man reciting an argument he had prepared in advance and was delivering with diminishing confidence. There was a schedule. There was a diplomatic meeting in Iron Pass that had already been delayed. There was a war chief who was, in all probability, in a state of controlled fury that expressed itself as extremely efficient logistics. Mara heard all of it. She told Davin she would leave in the afternoon. Then she came back inside and sat across from Calder at the table where he was cleaning his instruments, and she folded her hands in front of her and told him she had something to say and that she was going to say it directly because she didn't know another way. He set down what he was holding and gave her his full attention. She said that in the 8 days she had spent in his cabin, she had been, for the first time in 3 years, something resembling peaceful. She said he had treated her with a basic dignity that had nothing to do with what she represented to anyone, and that this was rarer than it had any right to be. She said she had not intended to feel what she felt, and that she understood the circumstances were unlikely, and the timing was complicated, and that none of that changed what she wanted to say. He was very still. She said she was asking him to come east with her. Not as an escort, not as a political attachment, not as anything that had a title or a function in the structure of her world. She was asking as Mara Stonefall, who had eaten his last of the hard cheese and argued with him about the logic of courtesy and wanted, if he was willing, to keep doing all of those things. She said she was not offering him a kingdom. She said she was offering him herself, complicated and demanding and occasionally blunt past the point of social grace, and that she understood if that wasn't a reasonable trade. She said this in a level voice with her hands flat on the table and her copper eyes on his face. And when she finished, she waited. He thought about Sarah. He thought about the cold draft in the east wall. He thought about the carved wooden bird his father had made the winter before the tree came down, and that sat on the shelf above the window and had sat there since he was 14 years old. He thought about her hand against his jaw. He told her he was afraid. She said she knew. He told her he wasn't what her world expected. He wasn't political, wasn't powerful, couldn't fight the way her people fought, wouldn't be an asset to anyone's calculations, and that people would question her judgment for choosing him, and he thought she deserved to know that he understood all of that before she asked again. She said she was aware of all of that. She said she was asking anyway. He looked at his hands for a long moment, the ordinary, capable, unremarkable hands of a Rivertown healer who had never been chosen for anything and had learned, carefully and over years, to find that acceptable. He told her he didn't want her kingdom. She said she knew. He told her he wanted her to be sure it was him she was asking for, not the idea of someone uncomplicated, not a thing she wanted because she was tired of everything being complicated. She said she was not asking for something uncomplicated. She said she was asking for exactly him, and that she had thought about it with the same care she gave to every decision that mattered, and that she was not in the habit of asking for things without being certain. He believed her. That was the thing. He looked at her across the table in his patched roof cabin, and he believed every word. He said yes. The smile that crossed her face was not the small corner of the mouth thing he had seen before, the one she pulled back almost immediately, as if smiling fully in view of another person was a kind of vulnerability she hadn't approved. This one was wider and less guarded and entirely real, and it lasted only a moment before she collected herself. But he saw it, and it settled somewhere inside him like a coal finding its place in the grate, warm, with the feeling of something arriving where it was supposed to be. He said he would need a day to arrange things, to talk to Agnes, and to sort the cabin, to bring the books. She told Davin they were leaving in 2 days. They sat for a moment in the silence of two people who have just changed the shape of their future. Then she asked if there was any of the hard cheese left. He started laughing, and she let herself smile again, and the afternoon light came through the window and lay across the table between them, warm and unhurried. He said his goodbyes to Agnes the evening before they left. She listened to the whole of it without interrupting, sitting at her kitchen table with her hands around her tea, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said she had been wondering when he would find a reason to leave. She said it without sadness, without sentimentality. She said his kind of knowing, the forest, the plants, the reading of things that didn't speak in words, was the kind that got wasted in a town that had already been mapped. He told her she had given him everything. She told him to stop being dramatic and pack the good herb knife. He packed the good herb knife and the 4 books and the carved wooden bird his father had made, because some things you didn't leave behind, regardless of the weight. The road east was 4 days long, and every one of them carried a different weight. Calder rode slightly apart from the group on a horse that Davin had sourced with the efficiency of a man who solved logistical problems before they became problems. He was aware constantly of being assessed. The 4 riders of Mara's guard did not speak to him directly for the first 2 days. They did not speak about him where he could hear. They simply watched, with the unhurried attention of people accustomed to evaluating things correctly under pressure. He was human, small by any comparison available, not a warrior by any readable measurement. He had no clan, no rank, no story they could place him within. He focused on the road and did not try to explain himself. Mara rode beside him more than she rode beside her guard. This was noticed. He suspected it was intended to be noticed. The landscape changed as they moved east, with a deliberateness that felt almost intentional. The soft-floored old growth giving way to drier, more open timber. the timber giving way to the rocky upper slopes where the trees grew sparse and wind-bent, and the sky came down in a way that made everything feel exposed and honest. Calder watched it all with the attention of someone cataloging a new country, which was exactly what he was doing. On the second evening, they made camp in a hollow below a granite outcrop that cut the wind. The fire was small and practical, and the meal was trail rations that Davin produced with quiet efficiency. Calder sat slightly outside the circle and watched the mountains go dark and thought about Agnes's kitchen and the way she had told him to stop being dramatic. After the others had turned in, Mara came and sat beside him. Not close, not in the way of the cabin yard, just beside him, with the fire and the dark outside it and the sound of the horses shifting in the cold. She was quiet for a while, watching the coals. Then she told him about the night after her husband's funeral. She told it the way she had told him about the ambush. Facts first, emotion carefully managed in that practiced way of hers. Carvin had been a good man, not a great love, she said, but a partner she had respected. A fellow commander who had died of a wound infection after what should have been a minor border engagement. She had stood at the burial in full armor with her chin up and her face arranged correctly because that was what the role required. Then she had gone back to her tent and sat until morning. No one came. Not her father's advisors, not her senior commanders, not the women who had known her since childhood. There was no protocol for comforting the heir. There was no mechanism for it. Her grief was a private matter, and everyone understood that. And so everyone had given her exactly what the role demanded and nothing of what she actually needed. She had sat in that tent until the light came back, very alone, and something had hardened in her that night in a way that was useful for leadership and terrible for everything else. She said she had been hardened for 3 years. She said she had grown so accustomed to it that she sometimes forgot hardness was not the same thing as strength. Calder listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he told her about Thomas, the river in January, the ice that looked solid and wasn't, the 8-year-old boy who had gone in on a Tuesday afternoon. He told her about going in after him, about the cold that hit like a wall, about the specific quality of that half-inch of water between his hand and the boy's coat. He told her Thomas had survived. He told her about the 2 fingers. He said he had carried that winter inside his chest ever since. Not the cold, but the feeling of almost. He said it was why his feet moved the way they did. He said he had never said that out loud before. She looked at the fire for a long time after that. Then she said that both of them had been shaped by the thing they couldn't stop, and that it had cost them something and made them something, and she wasn't sure yet whether those 2 things balanced. He said he wasn't sure either. They sat with that, the fire between them and the mountains dark on all sides, and for a while neither of them was the heir of anything or the healer of anything. They were just 2 people in the dark with their honest shapes, and that was enough. The Stone Clan's stronghold appeared on the 4th afternoon as something that had grown from the mountain rather than been built against it. It rose from the first rise of the eastern Cascades in layered granite walls, wide and low in the way of things meant to last rather than to impress. Its towers built for sightlines rather than ceremony. Inside the outer wall, the scale of it revealed itself gradually. Not a fortress, but a settlement. A working seat of power that smelled of iron and pine smoke, and the density of a place where hundreds of people had been living in close quarters for a long time. Everyone stopped when they rode in, not all at once. In the way of a community that registered arrivals automatically, a pause in the work, a turn of the head, the natural assessment of who was coming through the gate and what it meant. The pause lasted a beat longer than usual when they registered who was riding beside the heir. Calder kept his eyes forward and his posture even and thought about the road. Aldrich Stonefall received them in the Great Hall. He was large in the way that spoke of bone structure rather than effort, and he had been hard for a long time in the same way the granite walls had been hard. Not through any particular drama, but through continuous pressure and the slow removal of everything soft. He had Mara's copper eyes, 30 years deeper. He stood at the head of the hall's long table and watched them cross the stone floor with the focused attention of a man who had made rapid, accurate evaluations his primary professional skill for 4 decades. He looked at Calder for 3 full seconds before he looked at his daughter. They spoke in the clan tongue. Calder watched the exchange without understanding the words. He could read the shape of it, the weight of what Aldrich said, The tone of Mara's answer, which was not a negotiation, she was informing, not discussing. There was a long pause at the end of it, and then Aldrich looked at Calder again. He asked in careful, precise English what Calder's skills were. Calder said herbalism, wound care, basic field medicine, the reading of forest terrain, and the plants within it. Aldrich said a healer was useful. Calder said they generally were. A silence followed that had weight behind it. Then Aldrich said heavily that he wanted it understood that his concerns were noted. Mara said they were. Aldrich looked at Calder one final time, a long, assessing look that gave nothing away. And then he moved to the business of the return, and the hall resumed its function around them. It was not acceptance. Calder knew it was not acceptance. But it was a door left standing open, which was more than he had expected, and he filed it alongside everything else the road had taught him about the difference between patience and surrender. He spent his first week learning the rhythms of the stronghold, the way he had learned the rhythms of the old growth, through attention, through repetition, through caring enough to notice the small things before the large ones. The stronghold had its own grammar. The movements of its people followed patterns that were legible once you understood what they indicated. The training schedules in the yard, the rotation of the watch on the walls, the morning assembly in the Great Hall, the hierarchy of who sat where at the long tables and what that communicated to everyone else. He was the anomaly in the grammar. He knew it and didn't fight it. Mara had set him up in the healer's room, a long stone chamber off the east corridor with good light from 2 high windows and enough shelf space to organize a proper dispensary. The clan's existing healers were 2 women named Tessa and Bryn, who had been practicing traditional medicine for decades and who received Calder with the professional wariness of people accustomed to having their expertise questioned by outsiders. He did not question their expertise. He asked questions about theirs and answered questions about his, and by the 4th day they were talking across the work table with the ease of people who had discovered their knowledge fit together at the edges in ways that were useful to both. Tessa knew plants he had never encountered. He knew applications for plants she had considered purely ceremonial. Bryn had a technique for treating deep tissue bruising that Agnes had never mentioned, and that he spent an afternoon learning properly. It was on the 7th day that the girl appeared in the doorway. She was 12 or close to it, small and wiry with the copper-tinged eyes that seemed to run through the clan, and an expression of concentrated skepticism that suggested she had decided in advance that whatever was happening in this room was probably not as interesting as advertised. Her name was Kyle. She had been sent by Tessa, who had apparently decided that the human healer's way of explaining things was different enough to be worth the girl's time. Kale sat on the stool by the window and watched Calder grind dried bark and asked, without any preliminary, why he was using that particular bark instead of the more common substitute. He explained the difference in fever response between the 2 options and how the choice depended on the severity and the patient's baseline constitution. She listened with the focused, testing attention of someone checking the answer against something she already half knew. Then she asked a follow-up question that was sharp enough to require him to revise his explanation and give her a more precise answer. He did. She considered this. Then she asked another question. That was how the teaching started, not as a program or a decision, just as the natural consequence of someone asking and someone else having the answer, and neither of them seeing a reason to stop there. The formal challenge came on a Thursday, 3 weeks after they arrived. Calder was in the dispensary when Tessa came to find him, her expression neutral in the careful way that indicated she was carrying news she had not decided how to frame. She told him there was a session of the clan council in an hour and that his presence had been requested. He asked why. She told him with the directness he had come to associate with Stone Clan communication that a warrior named Goran had invoked the old rite of challenge for the heir's hand, and that by tradition, the challenge party was required to be present. Calder put down the mortar. He asked what form the challenge took. Tessa said that was up to the challenger to specify, and that Goran had specified it that morning. He asked what Goran had specified. Tessa looked at him for a moment with a complicated expression. Then she said, cartography. She explained. There was a section of old growth forest on the clan's northern boundary, several square miles of terrain that the Stone Clan had been unable to map reliably for 2 generations. 3 separate expeditions had attempted it over the past 40 years. None had produced a map that could be trusted for navigation. It was a known gap in the clan's operational knowledge and a source of long-standing practical inconvenience. Gorn had specified a trial of navigation, mapped the northern forest reliably and completely within 2 days. Calder stood in the dispensary and thought about this. He thought about the old growth east of Ashwood and the 12 years he had spent learning its grammar before he could read a word of it. He thought about game trails and water-seeking routes and the way moss grew on granite in the lee of the prevailing wind and what that told you, if you knew how to ask, about every hill and hollow for half a mile in any direction. He thought about Thomas in the river, the reaching, the half-inch of water between his hand and what he was trying to hold. He thanked Tessa and went to find clean parchment and his herb knife. In the Great Hall an hour later, with the council in their seats and the clan gathered in the way, that important things drew people without announcement, Goran stood and stated his challenge formally. He was older than Calder had expected, somewhere in his 40s, decorated with the weight of someone who had earned rather than inherited his standing. He stated the terms without looking at Calder. He stated them as a man who considered the outcome already determined, which was not arrogance exactly. It was the reasonable assessment of a man who had no frame of reference for what Calder had spent his life learning. Mara sat at the council table and did not look at Calder. He understood. This was not the place for her to speak on his behalf. Speaking on his behalf here would cost him something he could not get back. Aldrich stated the terms formally and asked whether the challenged accepted. Calder said he did. He went into the forest the next morning at first light, alone with 2 sheets of good parchment, a stick of charcoal, his herb knife, and the quality of attention that Agnes had first named for him when he was 15 years old, and he had not known what to call what he did when he walked into the trees. She had said, "You listen to it. Most people look at a forest. You listen to it." He listened for 2 days. He came out of the forest on the second evening as the light was failing, walking the last mile in near dark with his hand trailing along the bark of the trees the way a man trails his hand along a familiar wall. His boots were wet through. His coat had a new tear along the left shoulder from a deadfall he had miscalculated in the gray of the second morning. The charcoal had worn to a stub, and he had finished the second sheet of parchment with the edge of a piece of flint, scoring the lines light and precise into the surface of the hide. He was hungry in a remote, academic way that suggested his body had moved past the immediate complaint and was simply noting the deficit for later. Davin was waiting at the tree line. He said nothing. He looked at Calder's face for a moment, then at the rolled parchment under his arm, then fell into step beside him for the walk back to the stronghold. No questions, no commentary. The silence of a man who had been doing his job long enough to know when it didn't require words. Calder appreciated that more than he would have known how to say. The Great Hall was fuller than it had been for the first presentation of the challenge. Word had moved through the enclosed community the way it always moved, faster than announcement, quieter than news with a specificity that official channels never quite achieved. People knew he had gone in. People knew he had stayed 2 days. People had formed opinions about what that meant, and the opinions had arranged themselves along lines that Calder, even in his 3 weeks of learning the stronghold's grammar, could read in the posture of the room when he walked through the door. He unrolled the first sheet on the long table. The silence that followed was different from any silence he had experienced in the stronghold. It was not the silence of a room waiting. It was the silence of a room that had stopped waiting and was now revising something it had believed was settled. The map was complete, not sketched, not approximated. The forest's actual structure, the drainage patterns, the ridge lines, the false floors over the creek systems that had swallowed 2 of the previous expeditions, the navigable routes and the ones that looked navigable until they weren't, the 3 natural waypoints that a person could use in any weather to orient themselves without instruments. All of it laid out in precise, unhurried lines drawn by someone who had not been guessing. He unrolled the second sheet beside the first, the detail of the northern quadrant, where the previous expeditions had turned back. The piece of terrain that had defeated every approach from the south, and the single viable route through it, which came not from the south but from the northeast, along a ridge that was invisible from the valley floor, but that every animal trail in the area pointed toward, if you knew what animal trails were saying when they pointed. Gorn stood at the far end of the table. He did not speak for a long time. Calder stood at the other end and waited without impatience because patience was not something he had to perform. He had grown up in a forest and spent years sitting beside people who were in pain, and both of those things had taught him eventually that time was not something you needed to win against. When Goran finally spoke, he spoke in the clan tongue. The room was very still. Calder watched the faces around the table, reading what he could. He caught the moment when something shifted. A collective, nearly imperceptible adjustment, the physical equivalent of a room revising its notes. Several of the older warriors looked at the map and then at each other with expressions that had the shape of recognition rather than surprise. Mara translated it for him later, quietly, as they walked the stone parapet in the cold evening air, with the stronghold's torchlight rising below them and the first stars coming out over the eastern peaks. She said Goran had said, "The human reads the forest like a warrior reads an enemy." He had said, "That is worth knowing." Then she said Goran had withdrawn the challenge. Calder stood at the parapet wall and looked at the dark mountain ridgeline and thought about a man he had never spoken to who had set him an impossible task with the genuine belief that it was impossible, and who had then, when proven wrong, said something honest about it in front of his entire community. He told Mara he thought Goran was probably a good man in an impossible position. She looked at him. He said that a person could be wrong about something and still be worth understanding. He said he thought Goran had not done what he had done out of malice. He thought Goran had done it out of a real belief that he was the right choice for her, and that the challenge was a legitimate way of testing a question that mattered. He said being wrong about a question that matters did not make someone small. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said he was the only person she had ever encountered who responded to a formal challenge against his right to exist in her life by considering the challenger's point of view. He said he didn't think that was remarkable. She said she knew he didn't. She said that was the part that was remarkable. She reached over and took his hand. Not the formal touch from the cabin yard, not the deliberate, declared gesture that he would learn later had specific weight in Stone Clan custom, a weight she had given it knowing exactly what she was giving. This was simpler than that, her hand taking his in the cold because she wanted to. The ordinary, unremarkable intimacy of two people who had decided. He held it. Below them, the stronghold went about its evening. Torches coming alive in the yard, voices carrying up through the stone in fragments, the sound of the training hall winding down for the night, and the kitchen beginning its separate rhythm. The mountain cold moved across the parapet in slow waves, and above them the stars continued their patient, indifferent work. The morning after the council session, before Calder had slept properly or eaten anything substantial, Davin appeared in the doorway of his room and told him, with the compressed efficiency of a man who dealt in facts rather than reassurance, that the surviving guard from the ambush had been located at a way station 2 days east of Ashwood. The sealed letter had been retrieved. Whatever crisis it had been carrying had been closed before it opened. Davin said this the way he said everything, once clearly and without editorial, and then he left. Calder stood alone in the room for a moment and thought about 10 days and 2 days and the arithmetic of things that almost don't work out. He thought about Mara sitting in the cabin on the fourth evening, telling him about the letter in that same level, factual tone she used for tactical information, and the particular effort it must have taken to sit still in someone else's house and eat dried plums and wait for her shoulder to heal, while a clock ran inside her. He thought about all the things that had to go exactly right for them to be standing on that parapet the night before. He was quiet for a long time. Then Kale appeared in the doorway behind Davin's departing back and asked with magnificent impatience whether they were working today or not, because she had questions about the elderflower tincture that were not going to answer themselves. He told her they were working. They got to work. The winter settled over the eastern Cascades the way winter settled there, not gently, not as a suggestion, but as a declaration. The passes closed. The road west became a thing you planned for spring rather than traveled. The stronghold turned inward in the way of communities that had been doing this for generations, that had learned to find in the confinement not a hardship, but a different kind of rhythm. Calder found that he had been preparing for this his whole life without knowing it. He had spent years in a cabin at the edge of a forest through Oregon winters, alone with 4 books and a hearth, in the company of whatever the quiet provided. He had learned that the quality of a winter depended not on its length, but on what you brought into it, and that what you brought into it depended on whether you had people and purpose. Those two things together were as close to enough as life generally offered. He had both now. The dispensary in winter became something more than a workroom. It became a gathering place, in the informal way of spaces where useful things happened. Tessa and Bryn were there most mornings. Kale was there most afternoons. Davin appeared occasionally with questions about the treatment of cold weather injuries that were practical rather than conversational, and stayed longer than the questions required. And Calder took careful note of this and said nothing about it and offered him tea. The stronghold was learning him the way he had learned it, gradually through the accumulation of small things. The way you learned a forest not in a day but over years of returning. He would not pretend it was complete. There were still moments when a room adjusted at his entrance in a way that reminded him, gently but unmistakably, that the adjustment was necessary. There were still evenings at the long table when he was the exception to every category people understood, and the exception had to be explained anew to someone who had not yet encountered it. And the explaining had its own particular fatigue. But there were also the other evenings. There was the evening that Goran sat down across from him at the far end of the table and asked, without preface, whether Calder had ever mapped the western sections of the forest or whether the northern quadrant had been the extent of his experience. Calder said the northern quadrant had been his first time in the clan's old growth, but that he had been working in the Ashwood old growth for most of his life and could discuss the comparative terrain if that was useful. Goran said it might be. They talked for an hour, not about anything personal, about forest systems and seasonal behavior and the way drainage patterns changed navigable routes in wet years versus dry. About the specific ridge formation the northern map had revealed and what it suggested about the watershed behavior further east. About the parts of the clan's territory that had not yet been mapped in the way the northern forest had now been mapped. When they were done, Goran nodded once and returned to the upper end of the table. It was not friendship. Calder did not call it friendship, but it was the beginning of a conversation between two people who had discovered they had something real to talk about, and that was its own kind of thing, worth more, in his experience, than most things that announced themselves as larger. A bundle arrived at the stronghold 6 weeks into winter, carried by a westbound trader who had been paid in advance to make sure it arrived intact. Inside, a paper packet of Agnes's anti-inflammatory compound, a small jar of her drawing salve, a bundle of dried herbs he hadn't been able to source in the Eastern Territory, and no note. No note because Agnes considered explanation optional. The items communicated everything the note would have said, and with considerably more precision. Calder stood alone in the dispensary and held the packet of compound and laughed for a full minute. When Kyle arrived and found him standing there grinning at a paper packet, she looked at him with the focused, slightly contemptuous expression she used when adults did things she considered beneath her dignity to acknowledge, and asked whether they were starting the morning preparation or whether he needed additional time to stand there being strange. He told her Agnes would like her very much. She said she didn't know who Agnes was. He said that was all right. He thought they would probably meet eventually. He wrote a letter back with the same trader, 2 pages in his close handwriting, telling her about the dispensary and Kekel and Tessa and the northern forest and the map and the challenge and the way the stronghold smelled in winter, pine smoke and cold stone, and the deep, specific scent of a place that had been inhabited continuously for a long time. He told her that the herb knife was still the best thing he owned. He told her she had been right about the wasted knowing. She wrote back in the spring 1 page, mostly questions about which plants grew in the eastern old growth that didn't grow in the Ashwood territory, and whether the altitude affected the alkaloid content of the bark compounds. At the bottom, in slightly smaller writing than the rest, good. She signed it the way she signed everything, AH, and nothing more, because Agnes considered signatures optional too. He kept the letter on his shelf beside the birds. It was 3 weeks after the challenge, on a still afternoon with the first serious cold of winter coming down from the peaks, that Aldrich Stonefall sent for him. Not through Mara, not through Davin, a direct summons delivered by one of the hall guards who handed Calder a folded note with his name on it and waited for acknowledgement. Calder read it. He told Kyle to finish the tincture without him. He washed his hands, dried them on the clean cloth, and went. Aldrich's private room was at the back of the stronghold's main structure, built into the mountain's first rise in a way that made it feel less like a room in a building and more like a room the mountain had agreed to provide. It was spare: a desk, two chairs, a fire, a single high window that looked north toward the peaks. No decoration except a clan map on the wall that was older than anyone currently alive and had been updated in different hands across 2 centuries, each edition in slightly different ink. Aldrich was standing at the window when Calder entered. He did not turn immediately. He stood with his hands clasped at his back, looking out at the mountain, and Calder stood in the center of the room and waited, because he had learned that patience here was not passivity, but presence, and presence was sometimes the only honest thing you had to offer. When Aldrich turned, he looked at Calder for a long moment, with the copper eyes that had assessed him in the great hall on the first day. They were the same eyes his daughter had, the same direct, evaluating quality, the same refusal to give information away through expression until the expression was deliberate. He gestured to the chair. Calder sat. Aldrich sat across from him, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the fire did its quiet work between them. Then Aldrich said, "I knew where she was on the third day." He said it without preamble, without building to it, in the flat tone of a man delivering a fact he had been carrying for a while and had decided it was time to put down. Calder was still. Aldrich said that Davin had found the wagon on the third day of the search. He said that Davin was very good at his work and that the river crossing east of Ashwood was not a complicated trail to follow. He said that Davin had sent a rider with a report that described the situation clearly: the location, the condition of the wagon, the direction of travel, the single set of footprints moving toward a cabin a quarter-mile from the Ashwood tree line. He paused. He said, "I had a full guard detail ready to ride within the hour." The fire shifted, a log settled. Outside the high window, the first snowflakes of the season had begun to move against the gray sky, small, tentative, not yet committing. Calder waited. Aldrich said that Davin's report had included one additional detail. He said that Davin had a protocol for reporting the air's condition, using specific language to indicate her status across a range of conditions from critical to functional. He said there was one phrase in the protocol that Davin had not used in 3 years of service. He looked at Calder. He said, the phrase was, "She is sleeping through the night." The room was very quiet. Calder looked at the fire. He thought about the sleeping mat by the cabin wall, the careful arrangement she had settled into. Back to the wall, good arm tucked close. The posture of someone who had learned that sleep in the wrong position was a vulnerability. He thought about the sound he had heard in the deep of the third night, the word in the clan tongue that had sounded like a name or an order. He thought about how, by the fifth morning, that sound had stopped. He had not known then what he was hearing. Aldrich said, "I stood down the detail. I told Davin to maintain observation and wait." He said it without softness, because that was not a register he appeared to use. But he said it with a directness that was its own kind of honesty. The honesty of a man who had made a decision he was not entirely comfortable with and was telling the truth about it anyway. He looked at Calder for a long moment. Then he said, "I am not thanking you." He said, "I am telling you I noticed." He stood then, the way a man stands when a thing has been said that needed saying and the meeting is complete. He moved toward the desk. Then he stopped. He said, without turning, "She has not been easy to raise." He said she had been born with her mother's will and his own stubbornness, and the combination had made her, at various points in her life, almost impossible to protect, almost impossible to advise, and almost impossible to stop once she had decided something. He paused. He said, "She decided you." He said it the way he said everything, flat, factual, without embellishment. But Calder heard what was underneath it, the way you heard things underneath other things when you had spent enough years sitting beside people who were in pain, learning the difference between what they said and what they meant. He was not thanking Calder. He was saying something more honest than thanks. He was saying, "I am her father, and I watched her sleep, and I chose to let the thing that was making her sleep continue, and I would do it again." Aldrich went to his desk and sat down and began reviewing something on its surface, and the audience was complete. Calder walked back through the stone corridor toward the dispensary. The snow was falling in earnest now beyond the high windows, white and indifferent to anything that had been decided within walls. On his workbench the next morning, placed precisely in the center where he could not miss it, was a small carved object. A bird. Not large, the size of his palm, worked from a piece of dark mountain cedar with the patience that showed in every cut. The wings were not spread. The bird was simply sitting, still and composed, in the way of something that knew its own nature and did not feel the need to demonstrate it. There was no note. There was no note because Aldrich Stonefall was not a man who wrote notes about things that had already been said. Calder picked it up and held it for a moment. Then he placed it on the shelf beside his father's bird, the one he had carried east from Ashwood, because some things you didn't leave behind regardless of the weight, and the two birds sat together on the shelf above the dispensary window in the morning light. He stood and looked at them for a long time before Kael arrived and asked why he was standing there doing nothing. He told her to give him one more minute. She gave him the minute without complaint, which from Kael was its own kind of gift. The winter deepened and the stronghold found its rhythm. Calder learned to find his place within that rhythm, not by changing what he was, but by understanding clearly what he was. Not a warrior, not a clan member, not a political figure in any sense that the people here recognized. He was the healer who had mapped the northern forest. He was the man the air had chosen. He was Calder Hollis, unremarkable in most of the ways this world measured things, and useful in a few ways it had not yet thought to measure. He had come to understand exactly enough, not more than that. He did not claim to be more than that. But exactly enough was not a small thing. He had spent 26 years not being chosen for anything, learning to find that acceptable, learning to call the quiet by its right name. And now he was here, in a stone room in the eastern Cascades, with herbs drying from the ceiling and a girl asking him sharp questions and two carved birds on the shelf. And he was not performing contentment. He was simply content in the way of someone whose life had landed, finally, where it was supposed to be. On the evening he remembered most clearly, later, the snow was thick on the parapet walls, and the fire in their small room had been burning since mid-morning, and the whole of the stronghold was quieter than usual because the cold had driven even the most dedicated work indoors. He had been reading aloud, one of the 4 books, a history of the frontier territories written by a man who had clearly had opinions about everything and the confidence to inflict them on the reader at considerable length. Mara had claimed, when he first suggested it, to have no interest in human histories. She was now 6 weeks into their habit of evening reading, interrupting him on average every 3 pages to argue with the text. She was currently arguing with a passage about the organization of frontier trade routes in which the author had, in her view, fundamentally misunderstood the relationship between terrain and commerce in a way that would have been corrected immediately by anyone who had actually crossed a mountain pass in winter, rather than writing about crossing mountain passes in winter from the comfort of a presumably well-heated study. Calder let her finish. Then he pointed out that the historian had been dead for 200 years and was therefore unavailable for the debate. She said that was the historian's loss. He set the book down. She was leaning back against him, her head tilted slightly, the firelight moving across the line of her jaw, and the room smelled of wood smoke and cedar and dried mint and the unrepeatable quality of a space that 2 people have made their own through the accumulation of ordinary evenings. He put his chin on her shoulder. She turned her head slightly. He asked her quietly if she remembered what she had asked him at the river that first morning in the cold. She said she remembered. He said he had never answered it properly. She was still. He said he had given her the short answer at the river. Healer, injured person, couldn't walk away, and that the short answer was true as far as it went, but that it hadn't been the whole of it. He said he thought she deserved the whole of it now, if she wanted it. She said, "Tell me." He said he had cared because there was a person in pain who needed help, and because walking away from that had never once in his life been something he was capable of, and because somewhere in the 10 seconds between hearing the sound and reaching the river, he had already understood, without words, that this was the kind of moment that defined you. Not because it was large or important, but because it was the moment when what you actually believed got tested against what you said you believed, and the only honest response was to move. He paused. Then he said, "And because, as it turned out, you were also funny in a way you didn't know about, and direct in a way that most people aren't brave enough to be, and the first person I ever met who made me feel like being seen completely was something I could survive." He said, "And all of those things were true at the same time, and I stopped trying to put them in order a long time ago." The fire settled. Outside, the snow continued its patient work on the mountain. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she told him, directly, without decoration, in the way of someone who had learned that the decorated version always fell short of the true one, that he was the first person who had ever helped her without wanting something back. She said she had built the working structure of her adult life around the assumption that such a person did not exist, that everyone who approached her was in some relation to what she represented, her clan, her position, the things she controlled or embodied or promised. She said revising that assumption had required more adjustment than she had expected, and that she was still some days surprised by it. She said the good kind. He said he was glad she had revised it. She said she was too. The fire burned low. Her hand was on his arm in the ordinary way of two people who had run out of reasons to be careful with each other. Below them, the stronghold went about the business of its winter evening. Torches in the yard, voices in the corridor, the deep sound of a stone building holding its warmth. He thought about the morning at the river, the cold water in his boots, the calculation he had done without doing it, just moved, just went, just got there. And the copper eyes that had looked at him across the river shallows and asked the only question that had mattered. He had answered it 3 times now. The first time, standing in the shallows with the rain coming down, had been the shortest and most honest. Healer, injury, can't walk away. The second time, tonight, had been the longer version, the one that included her specifically, the one that said this particular person had turned out to be worth every cold draft and lonely evening he had ever sat through. The third version didn't need words. It was made of carved birds on shelves and a girl asking sharp questions in a stone room, and a war chief who was not thanking him but was saying something more honest than thanks, and a letter from Agnes written mostly in questions and signed with 2 initials and nothing more. It was made of Goran sitting down across from him at the far end of a long table and asking about forest systems. It was made of Tessa leaving notes on the workbench in the evenings. It was made of Davin falling into step beside him at the tree line without a word. He was living the third version. He had been living it for some time. Outside the window, the snow fell on the eastern Cascades the way it had fallen every winter for 10,000 years before him, and would fall every winter for 10,000 years after, without interest in any particular person or any particular evening. It covered the parapet and the yard and the outer wall and the road that wound west through the passes. And somewhere along that road, weeks of riding behind the snow, there was a small town at the edge of a forest where a woman named Agnes was reading by a fire, and the mill was silent and the river was running dark under its ice. And in a cabin a quarter mile from the nearest houses, with a roof patched so many times it looked like a quilt, and a door that didn't close straight unless you lifted while you pulled. The hearth was cold now, and the herbs were long gone from the ceiling beams, and on the single shelf above the window, 3 small clay jars sat where 4 books had been. Only one bird sat on the shelf. The other one was here. He had brought it east along with the books because some things you did not leave behind regardless of the weight, and because some things were not really about where they sat, but about the fact that you had carried them. The proof, quiet and wooden and undramatic, that you had come from somewhere and chosen to come here, and that both of those things were true at once and neither one canceled the other. Mara asked without moving what he was thinking about. He said, the door. She said, which door? He said, the cabin door. It didn't close straight unless you lifted while you pulled. He said he had never once in 3 years of living there managed to remember that until after he had already pulled, and the door had already stuck, and he was standing in the cold feeling like an idiot. She said she remembered the door. He said he knew she did. He said she had figured it out on the second morning without being told, and had never once gotten it wrong after that, and he had never said anything because he hadn't known what you were supposed to say about a thing like that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you notice things like that. He said, what things? She said, the things that don't announce themselves. She said most people walk past them. She said he collected them quietly and kept them. He said he had learned that from a long time in the forest. He said the forest didn't announce anything. It just was, and if you wanted to know it, you had to slow down enough to let it tell you. She said, you do that with people too. He said he supposed he did. She turned her head slightly more, enough to look at the side of his face, and he could feel the quality of her attention, that same focused, unhurried observation she had given him from the first morning at the river, the one that had nothing to do with assessment now, and everything to do with simply looking at something she did not intend to look away from. He looked back at her. The fire had burned down to coals. The room was warm and quiet and entirely theirs, the walls holding the winter out with the patience of something that had been doing it for a very long time. He thought about a morning in October, rain coming down on a country road, cold water filling his boots, and a pair of copper eyes asking him a genuine question. He thought about the half-inch of water between his hand and Thomas in the river, and the reaching and the almost, and how all his life he had carried the feeling of almost as a kind of debt. He didn't feel it anymore. He was not sure exactly when it had lifted. Somewhere between the river and this room, between the first evening when she had eaten his thin broth without comment, and this evening with the fire low and her hand on his arm, the almost had become something else. Not a debt, not a wound, just the shape of the path that had brought him here, specific and unrepeatable, and he would not have changed a step of it. Outside the window, the snow fell. Two birds sat on the shelf, and somewhere in the stronghold, a girl with sharp questions and copper-tinged eyes was probably already composing the question she planned to lead with in the morning. It was not a simple life. It was not a simple thing, and it would not get simpler quickly. And there would continue to be mornings when the distance between their worlds made itself felt before noon, and he and Mara both understood that and were not pretending otherwise. But there was also this. There was this evening and the ones before it and the ones that were coming. Against everything that had said it was impossible. The distance, the difference, the weight of what she was, and the ordinariness of what he was. These evenings were enough. They were more than enough. They were, in the final accounting that mattered, everything.